The year was 1978, and Hollywood was buzzing with excitement. Disco music filled the air, bell-bottoms were everywhere, and the movie industry was churning out hits one after another. In the middle of all this glamour lived a woman named Elena Rodriguez, a 32-year-old actress who had spent the last decade clawing her way up from small theater productions to finally getting her big break. Elena wasn't born into wealth or fame. She grew up in a modest neighborhood in Los Angeles, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who worked day and night to give their children a better life. Her father fixed cars at a local garage, while her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beverly Hills. From a young age, Elena was mesmerized by the stories her mother would tell about the big mansions, the fancy parties, and the movie stars who seemed to live in a different world altogether. But Elena didn't just dream. She worked. While her classmates were out enjoying their weekends, she was rehearsing lines for community theater productions. She took acting classes whenever she could afford them, sometimes trading babysitting services for lessons. Her parents didn't quite understand her obsession with acting. They wanted her to become a teacher or a nurse, something stable and respectable. But Elena had fire in her eyes, and once she set her mind on something, there was no stopping her. By her mid-20s, Elena had made a name for herself in the Los Angeles theater scene. Directors knew her as the woman who never missed a rehearsal, who could cry on command and who brought depth to even the smallest roles. It was only a matter of time before Hollywood came calling. Her first film role was tiny, just 3 lines in a crime drama, but she made those 3 lines count. The camera loved her expressive eyes and natural presence. More roles followed. She played a worried sister here, a store clerk there, a witness to a crime in another film. None of these roles made her famous, but they kept her working. More importantly, they kept her in the game. Elena knew that in Hollywood, persistence mattered just as much as talent. She showed up to every audition, networked at every party, and never let rejection slow her down. Then came the phone call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 1978, when her agent called with news that made her heart race. A major studio wanted her for the leading role in their upcoming thriller. Not a supporting character, not a background player, but the star, the lead actress. Elena could barely believe it. After all those years of struggle, of being told she wasn't quite right for this role or that one, someone finally saw what she had always known was there. The film was called Midnight Running, and it was about a journalist uncovering corruption in a small town. It was exactly the kind of meaty role Elena had been waiting for. The script was strong, the director was respected, and the budget was substantial. This wasn't just another job. This was her chance to prove she belonged among Hollywood's elite. Filming began in late spring, and Elena threw herself into the role with everything she had. The cast and crew adored her. She was always prepared, always professional, and always kind. Unlike some actors who became difficult once they got their first big break, Elena remained humble and hardworking. She remembered where she came from and treated everyone on set with respect, from the director down to the production assistants. Her younger sister, Rosa, visited the set several times. Rosa was 27, married with a young daughter, and worked as a secretary at a law firm. She had always been Elena's biggest cheerleader, even when their parents worried about Elena's unstable career choice. Rosa would watch her sister perform take after take, amazed at how Elena could transform into someone else entirely. "You're going to be famous," Rosa told her one day during a lunch break. "I just know it." Elena laughed, but there was hope in her eyes. "Maybe, but even if I'm not, at least I'm doing what I love." The movie wrapped in late October. The director told Elena she had done an incredible job, and word around the studio was that she might even get some awards attention. The producers threw a wrap party at a restaurant in the Hollywood Hills, one of those places with sweeping views of the city lights below. Everyone who had worked on the film was there, celebrating months of hard work finally coming to an end. Elena wore a simple but elegant burgundy dress that night. Several people at the party remembered her laughing, dancing, and talking excitedly about future projects. She had already received 3 scripts from other producers who had heard about her performance. Everything was falling into place. Around 11 o'clock that night, Elena told a few people she was tired and ready to head home. She had parked her car, a light blue 1975 Ford sedan, in the lot outside the restaurant. Several people watched her walk to her car, waving goodbye as she drove away. The drive from the Hollywood Hills to her apartment in West Hollywood should have taken about 20 minutes. But Elena never made it home. When she didn't show up for a scheduled meeting the next morning, people assumed she was sleeping off the party. But when her sister Rosa called that evening and got no answer, worry started to creep in. Rosa knew Elena never missed family phone calls. They talked almost every day. By the next morning, when Elena still couldn't be reached, Rosa drove to her apartment and found it empty. The bed was made. Yesterday's mail sat unopened on the counter. It looked like Elena had never come home. Rosa immediately called the police. At first, they didn't take it too seriously. Young women in Hollywood sometimes took off for a few days, they said. Maybe she went away to clear her head. But Rosa knew better. Elena wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. She was responsible, organized, and deeply connected to her family. Then came the discovery that made everyone's blood run cold. 2 days after Elena vanished, a hiker found her car parked on a dirt shoulder along Mulholland Drive, not far from the restaurant where the party had been held. The car was unlocked. Her purse was on the passenger seat, wallet and identification still inside. Her keys were in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing broken. It was as if Elena had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into thin air. The police launched a full investigation. They interviewed everyone at the party, searched the surrounding hills, and checked hospitals and morgues throughout Los Angeles County. They found nothing. No witnesses who saw anything suspicious. No enemies who might have wanted to hurt her. No financial problems or personal troubles that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Elena Rodriguez had simply ceased to exist. The newspapers ran stories about the missing actress. Television news covered the case. Tips poured in, but none of them led anywhere. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed down. Other cases demanded attention. The reporters moved on to newer stories. And slowly, painfully, the world began to forget about Elena Rodriguez, but her family never forgot. Rosa especially refused to accept that her sister was gone forever. Deep in her heart, she believed that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. The first year after Elena disappeared was the hardest. Rosa couldn't sleep properly. Every time the phone rang, her heart would jump, hoping it was news about her sister. Every time she saw a woman with dark hair from behind, she would catch her breath, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was Elena. But it never was. Elena's parents aged overnight. Her father, Miguel, stopped going to the garage for weeks. He would just sit in his chair staring at old photographs of Elena as a little girl. Elena in her first school play. Elena graduating high school. Her mother, Carmen, lit candles at church every single day, praying for her daughter's safe return. The not knowing was the worst part. If something terrible had happened, at least they could grieve and find some kind of closure. But this endless uncertainty was like a wound that never healed. The movie Elena had worked so hard on, Midnight Running, was released 6 months after her disappearance. The studio didn't know what to do. Part of them wanted to use the publicity, but it felt wrong to profit from a tragedy. They released it quietly with minimal promotion. Rosa forced herself to watch it in an empty theater one afternoon. Seeing her sister on that big screen, so alive and vibrant, was almost unbearable. Elena's performance was brilliant. Critics who bothered to review the film noted that the lead actress showed real promise. But by then, most people assumed Elena Rodriguez was dead. Detective Frank Chen had been assigned to Elena's case from the beginning. He was a 15-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, experienced with missing persons investigations. Something about Elena's case bothered him deeply. The evidence didn't add up. Why would someone leave their car with their purse inside? If she had been kidnapped, why was there no demand for ransom? If she had run away, why didn't she take anything with her? Frank followed every lead, no matter how small. He interviewed Elena's neighbors, her acting teacher, people she had worked with on various productions. Everyone said the same thing. Elena was responsible, focused, and deeply connected to her family. She wouldn't just leave. He searched through her apartment multiple times, looking for anything that might explain her disappearance. He found a day planner where Elena kept track of her appointments, but the entries for the days after the wrap party were routine. Lunch with her agent, a callback audition, dinner with Rosa. One lead seemed promising at first. A woman called the police saying she had seen Elena at a bus station in Arizona, 3 weeks after the disappearance, Frank drove all the way there, showed Elena's photograph around, and even reviewed security footage. It wasn't her, just someone who looked similar. Another tip came from a man who claimed he had seen someone matching Elena's description working at a diner in Oregon. Again, Frank investigated. Again, it led nowhere. As months turned into years, the case went cold. Frank was assigned other investigations, but he kept Elena's file on his desk. He couldn't let it go. Even when his colleagues told him he needed to move on, that some cases just never get solved, Frank held on to hope that something would break. Rosa channeled her grief into action. She started volunteering with organizations that helped families of missing persons. She attended support groups where she met other people living with the same terrible uncertainty. There were parents whose children had vanished, spouses whose partners never came home, siblings like her who lost someone without explanation. These meetings were painful but somehow comforting. At least she wasn't alone in her suffering. By 1983, 5 years after Elena's disappearance, Rosa had started advocating for better resources for missing persons cases. She spoke at community meetings, wrote letters to politicians, and pushed for changes in how police departments handled these investigations. It gave her purpose during a time when she felt helpless. She couldn't bring Elena back, but maybe she could help prevent other families from going through the same nightmare. Rosa's daughter, little Isabel, who had been only 3 when Elena disappeared, grew up hearing stories about the aunt she barely remembered. Rosa made sure Isabel knew who Elena was, the determined woman who followed her dreams, the loving sister who never missed a birthday, the talented actress who was on the verge of something great. In Rosa's home, Elena's photographs were everywhere. Her memory was kept alive through stories told at dinner tables and bedtime. Elena's father, Miguel, passed away in 1987. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but Rosa knew better. He died of a broken heart, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Carmen, Elena's mother, lived until 1992, but she was never the same after Miguel died. In her final years, she would sometimes forget that Elena was missing and would ask when she was coming to visit. Rosa didn't have the heart to remind her. Detective Frank Chen retired in 1995. On his last day at the precinct, he handed Elena's case file to a younger detective, a woman named Lisa Torres, who promised to review it periodically. Frank had spent 17 years thinking about Elena Rodriguez. He had investigated hundreds of other cases, solved most of them, but this one haunted him. At his retirement party, when colleagues asked what his one regret was, he didn't hesitate, not finding out what happened to that actress from 1978. The area where Elena's car had been found changed dramatically over the years. What was once a remote stretch of road became prime real estate. Developers bought up the hillsides and started building luxury homes with million-dollar views. The dirt shoulder where Elena's Ford sedan had been discovered was now part of someone's private driveway. The restaurant where the rap party had been held was torn down and replaced with a modern mansion. Hollywood changed too. The studio system that had been so powerful in the 70s started to crumble. Independent films became popular. New stars rose and fell. The executives and producers who had been powerful when Elena disappeared either retired, died, or lost their influence. The film industry Elena had worked so hard to break into transformed into something she might not have recognized. Rosa, now in her early 50s by the year 2000, had built a life around her sister's absence. She had raised Isabel, who was now in college studying law. She had helped dozens of families navigate the nightmare of having a missing loved one. She had become a respected advocate whose opinions were sought by law enforcement and legislators. But despite all her accomplishments, there was a hole in her heart that never filled. She still thought about Elena every single day. Sometimes she wondered if her sister had somehow started a new life somewhere, if maybe she was living under a different name, happy and safe. Other times, usually late at night, Rosa accepted the more likely truth, that something terrible had happened to Elena that night in 1978, and they would probably never know what it was. Rosa kept a box of Elena's things in her closet. Letters Elena had written, a scarf she used to wear, the program from one of her theater productions. Sometimes Rosa would take these items out and hold them, trying to feel some connection to the sister she had lost. She would close her eyes and remember Elena's laugh, her determination, the way she would practice her lines while doing dishes. 22 years had passed since that October night in 1978. The world had moved on. Technology had advanced. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Personal computers were in homes. The internet was changing everything. But for Rosa, time had stopped at 11 o'clock on that October evening when Elena drove away from a party and never came home. What Rosa didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the earth itself was about to give up its secrets. Nature has a way of revealing what humans try to hide, and sometimes the truth stays buried until the ground itself decides it's time. February 2000 brought one of the worst storms Southern California had seen in decades. The weather forecasters had been warning about it for days. El Niño was causing havoc up and down the coast, and the Hollywood Hills were particularly vulnerable. Years of drought followed by sudden heavy rainfall created the perfect conditions for disaster. The ground, baked hard by years of dry weather, couldn't absorb the water fast enough. When the rains came, they came hard. For 3 days straight, water poured from the sky. Streets flooded. Trees came down. Power lines snapped. And in the hills above Los Angeles, where million-dollar homes clung to steep slopes, the earth itself began to move. Mudslides were reported across the area. Families were evacuated from their homes. Emergency services worked around the clock, trying to keep everyone safe. On the morning of the fourth day, February 15th, the rain finally stopped. The sun came out, revealing the damage left behind. It looked like the hillside had been torn apart. Trees were uprooted. Roads were buried under tons of mud and debris. Entire sections of hillside had simply slid away, leaving raw earth exposed like an open wound. A construction crew from Garcia Brothers Development had been working on a luxury housing project in the Hollywood Hills for the past 8 months. The site was on a slope that offered breathtaking views of the city below. They were building 5 custom homes, each one worth several $1,000,000. The storm had set them back significantly. When the crew arrived that morning to assess the damage, their hearts sank. Months of work had been undone in just a few days. The crew foreman, a man named Antonio Garcia, stood looking at what used to be the foundation for the largest home. A massive mudslide had swept through, carrying away equipment and building materials. The hillside had collapsed, revealing layers of earth that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Antonio knew they would need to bring in geologists to make sure the site was even safe to continue building on. "Boss, you need to see this," shouted Carlos, one of the younger workers. He was standing about 50 feet down the slope, near where the mudslide had stopped. Antonio carefully made his way down, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. As he got closer, he saw what Carlos was pointing at. Something metal was sticking out of the mud, glinting in the morning sun. At first, Antonio thought it was just debris from the construction site, maybe part of a fence or some old building material buried long ago, but as he looked closer, his stomach tightened. That wasn't construction debris. It was a car bumper. Chrome, bent and dirty, but definitely a car bumper from an old vehicle. "Call the site supervisor," Antonio said quietly. "Tell him we need to stop work immediately." More crew members gathered around. Using shovels, they carefully began removing mud from around the metal. What emerged made everyone fall silent. It was a car, completely buried in the hillside. Not just buried, but deep in the earth, at least 50 feet below what used to be the road level. The mud and debris from the landslide had exposed it, bringing it into view for the first time in over 2 decades. The car was a sedan from the 70s, light blue paint still visible in patches beneath the dirt and rust. The windows were completely covered with compacted earth. Vines and roots had grown through parts of the frame. This vehicle had been down there for a very long time, swallowed by the hillside and forgotten. Antonio immediately called the police. He had been in construction long enough to know that when you find something unusual, especially something that might involve people, you stop work and call the authorities. Within an hour, police cars and emergency vehicles lined the narrow road above the site. Officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape. A small crowd of curious neighbors gathered, wondering what was happening. Detective Lisa Torres was in her office when the call came through. A construction crew had found what appeared to be a vehicle buried in a hillside in the Hollywood Hills. "Could be nothing," the dispatcher said, but they needed someone to check it out. Lisa grabbed her jacket and headed out. Traffic was terrible because of the storm damage, but she made it to the site within 40 minutes. When she arrived, She found Antonio and his crew standing well back from the partially excavated vehicle. A tow truck operator who specialized in difficult recoveries was already there, assessing the situation. Lisa walked carefully down the slope, her eyes taking in every detail. The car had been buried deep, that much was clear. This wasn't someone who had driven off the road recently. This was old. Can you get it out? Lisa asked the tow truck operator, a weathered man named Pete who had been doing this work for 30 years. Yeah, but it's going to take some time, Pete replied. We need to do this carefully. If there's anyone inside, we don't want to disturb anything more than necessary. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm sun. Inside. The possibility hadn't fully registered until Pete said it out loud. She looked at the buried sedan and felt something she had learned to trust over her years as a detective. Intuition. This meant something. This was important. The recovery took most of the afternoon. Pete and his assistant used cables and a winch, pulling slowly and steadily. The car resisted at first, held tight by decades of compacted earth, but inch by inch it began to emerge. Mud poured from every opening. The tires were rotted away completely. The metal frame was corroded but still largely intact. When the car was finally free and sitting on more level ground, Lisa approached it carefully. Through the mud-covered windows, she could see shapes inside. Her heart was pounding. Other officers joined her, and together they carefully opened the driver's side door. It took some effort, the hinges frozen with rust and dirt. What they found inside made Lisa reach for her phone immediately. There were human remains in the driver's seat, preserved somewhat by the airtight seal the mud had created. But it wasn't just remains that caught her attention. There were personal items scattered throughout the vehicle. A shoe, pieces of fabric from clothing, and there on the dashboard, covered in dried mud but still visible, was a small leather wallet. Lisa carefully retrieved the wallet, her hand shaking slightly. She opened it with gloved fingers and found a driver's license inside. The plastic was warped, but the information was still readable. The photograph showed a beautiful woman with dark eyes and a confident smile. The name on the license made Lisa's breath catch: Elena Rodriguez. Lisa had been with the LAPD for 12 years, but she had heard about this case. Every detective in the department knew about Elena Rodriguez, the actress who vanished in 1978 and was never found. It was one of those legendary unsolved cases that people talked about, that showed up in training sessions as an example of how difficult missing persons investigations could be. And now, 22 years later, here was Elena's car. Not on Mulholland Drive, where her other vehicle had been found abandoned all those years ago, but here, buried deep in a hillside miles away from that location. Lisa's mind raced. If this was Elena's car, then the car found in 1978 must have been staged. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make it look like Elena had simply walked away from her vehicle. But the truth had been here all along, hidden beneath tons of earth, waiting for a storm to bring it back to the surface. Lisa looked at Antonio and his crew, who stood watching quietly. This is now a crime scene, she said firmly. Nobody touches anything else. We need forensics out here immediately. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the hillside, Lisa made the phone call she knew would change everything. She called the department's cold case unit and asked them to pull every file they had on Elena Rodriguez. After 22 years of silence, the earth had finally spoken. The question now was whether anyone was still alive who could explain what had really happened that night in 1978. The phone call came to Rosa's house at 7:30 in the evening. She was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when the phone rang. Isabel, home from college for the weekend, answered it. Rosa heard her daughter's voice change, becoming quiet and serious. When Isabel walked into the kitchen, her face was pale. "Mom, it's the police. They want to talk to you." Rosa's hands were shaking as she took the phone. After 22 years, she had almost stopped expecting this call. Detective Lisa Torres introduced herself and asked if Rosa could come to the station the next morning. They had found something, Lisa said carefully. Something related to Elena's case. She didn't say more, but Rosa understood. After 2 decades of nothing, the police didn't call unless it was serious. That night, Rosa barely slept. Her mind kept spinning through possibilities. Had they found Elena? Was she alive somewhere? Deep down, Rosa knew better than to hope for that. 22 years of silence meant only one thing. But still, the not knowing had been torture. Maybe now, finally, she would have answers. The next morning, Rosa sat in an interview room at the police station. Detective Lisa Torres sat across from her, along with 2 other detectives from the cold case unit. Lisa spoke gently, but there was no easy way to say it. They had found Elena's car buried in a hillside. They had found remains inside. Dental records would need to confirm it, but they were almost certain it was Elena. Rosa had prepared herself for this moment for years, but hearing the words out loud still felt like a punch to the stomach. She cried, not from surprise, but from the weight of finally knowing. Elena hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life somewhere. She had been there all along in those Hollywood hills waiting to be found. There's something else, Lisa said after giving Rosa a moment to compose herself. The car we found is not in the same location as the car that was discovered in 1978. This changes everything about the original investigation. Rosa looked up, confused. Lisa explained that the car found in 1978 on Mulholland Drive, with Elena's purse inside, had clearly been staged. Someone had deliberately placed it there to make it look like Elena had simply walked away. The real car, Elena's actual car, had been hidden much more carefully, buried in a location where it might never have been found if not for the landslide. Someone went to a lot of trouble to cover this up, Lisa said, and we're going to find out who. Over the next few weeks, a team of forensic specialists worked on the car and everything found inside it. The process was painstaking. Every item had to be carefully cleaned and examined. Every piece of evidence had to be documented and analyzed. Modern forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1978 were now available. And the team used every tool they had. One of the most important discoveries came from Elena's day planner, which had been in the car. It was in a waterproof zippered pouch, the kind Elena used to keep important documents safe. While the pages were damaged, forensic document specialists were able to recover most of the writing. They photographed each page under special lighting and used computer enhancement to read faded ink. What they found was revealing. In the days before her disappearance, Elena had made several notes that seemed unusual. There were initials that didn't match anyone from the film production. There were notations about financial discrepancies and studio books. One entry, dated 3 days before she disappeared, simply said, "Meeting with reporter Friday. Proof ready." Lisa started pulling files from 1978, looking for any mention of financial issues at the studio that had produced Midnight Running. It took days of digging through archives, but eventually she found something. There had been a federal investigation into the studio in 1979, about a year after Elena disappeared. They were looking into tax evasion and embezzlement. The investigation had ended inconclusively when key documents mysteriously went missing. The pieces were starting to come together. Lisa tracked down people who had worked at the studio in 1978. Many were retired or had left the industry. Some had passed away, but those who were still alive remembered the atmosphere back then. There were rumors, they said, about money being siphoned off from productions. Several people mentioned the name of a powerful executive producer named Victor Castellano, who had a reputation for running his projects like his own personal bank account. Victor Castellano had died in 1995, but Lisa wasn't ready to close the book yet. She dug deeper into his background and found something interesting. Victor had employed a personal bodyguard and driver, a man named Raymond Walsh. Raymond had worked for Victor for over 15 years, from the early 70s until Victor's death. Finding Raymond wasn't easy. He had moved out of state years ago and kept a low profile, but Lisa was persistent. She finally tracked him down to a small town in Nevada where he lived alone in a modest house. Raymond was 73 years old now, retired and living on a pension. When Lisa and 2 other detectives showed up at his door, his face went white. They brought Raymond back to Los Angeles for questioning. At first, he denied knowing anything about Elena Rodriguez. He barely remembered 1978, he claimed. His memory wasn't what it used to be. But when Lisa showed him photographs of the buried car, of the location where it was found, something in Raymond changed. His hands started trembling. He asked for water. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight for too long. "I want a lawyer," Raymond finally said. The lawyer Raymond hired was a public defender named Patricia Ruiz, who had handled plenty of cases but nothing quite like this. After several conversations with her client, Patricia came back to the prosecutors with a deal. Raymond was willing to talk, but he wanted immunity from first-degree murder charges. He would plead guilty to manslaughter and obstruction of justice, but that was it. The prosecution agreed. They wanted the truth more than they wanted to put a 73-year-old man away for life. What Raymond told them over the next several hours painted a picture of power, corruption, and a tragedy that could have been avoided. Raymond explained that in late 1978, Victor Castellano was in serious trouble. He had been embezzling money from studio productions for years, inflating budgets and pocketing the difference. Elena had somehow discovered proof of this scheme. She had been preparing to go public with evidence that would have destroyed Victor's career and likely sent him to prison. Victor panicked. He told Raymond that Elena needed to be dealt with before she could talk to anyone. Raymond claimed he was only supposed to scare her, to make it clear that she needed to stay quiet. On the night of the wrap party, Raymond followed Elena when she left. He ran her off the road in a remote area of the Hollywood Hills. Elena's car went down an embankment. Raymond said he checked on her and found her badly injured, but alive. That's when everything went wrong. Instead of calling for help, Raymond called Victor. Victor told him they couldn't risk Elena surviving and talking. Raymond claimed Victor ordered him to finish it, to make sure Elena couldn't tell anyone what she knew. Raymond, terrified of losing his job and possibly facing charges himself for what he'd already done, complied. Afterward, Raymond used construction equipment from a site Victor controlled to bury Elena's car deep in the hillside. Then he and Victor staged the scene on Mulholland Drive, using Elena's spare car key to drive her vehicle there and leave her purse inside. They made it look like Elena had walked away from her life. "I've lived with this every day for 22 years, Raymond said, tears running down his weathered face. "Every single day. I wanted to tell someone so many times, but I was afraid. And after Victor died, I thought maybe I could just take it to my grave. But I can't anymore. I can't." Lisa sat listening to this confession, thinking about Detective Frank Chen, who had worked this case for so many years and never got his answer. She thought about Rosa, who had spent more than 2 decades wondering what happened to her sister. And she thought about Elena, a talented woman whose life was stolen from her just as her dreams were about to come true. The forensic evidence supported Raymond's confession. Analysis of Elena's remains showed trauma consistent with his story. Soil samples from the burial site matched soil found on construction equipment, once owned by Victor's company. Even after all these years, science could still speak truth. Rosa was informed of everything. Hearing the details of how her sister died was agonizing, but it was also, in a strange way, a relief. The uncertainty that had haunted her for so long was finally over. Elena hadn't suffered for years in captivity. She hadn't abandoned her family. She had been murdered by people who valued money more than human life, and now everyone would know the truth. The trial of Raymond Walsh began in September 2000, 7 months after the discovery in the Hollywood Hills. The courthouse was packed every single day. News crews lined up outside, and reporters from across the country covered the story. It wasn't just another murder trial. This was a window into old Hollywood, into a time when powerful men thought they could get away with anything. Raymond pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice, just as his deal specified. There would be no jury, just a sentencing hearing where the judge would decide his fate. But before that sentencing, the prosecution wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly what had happened and why. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Helen Vasquez, methodically laid out the evidence. She showed photographs of the buried car, of the construction equipment used to hide it, of the documents proving Victor Castellano's embezzlement scheme. She brought in forensic experts who explained how they had recovered evidence from the car after 22 years. She showed the court Elena's day planner, with its notes about financial discrepancies and the planned meeting with a reporter. The courtroom listened in silence as the full story unfolded. Elena Rodriguez hadn't just been an actress trying to make it in Hollywood. She had stumbled onto a crime, one that involved millions of dollars stolen over years. She had been brave enough to gather evidence and prepare to expose it. And for that courage, she had paid with her life. Raymond sat at the defense table looking smaller and older than his 73 years. When it was time for him to speak, his voice shook. He apologized to Rosa and her family, He said he knew his words meant nothing, that no apology could bring Elena back or erase 22 years of pain. He claimed he had been terrified of Victor Castellano, that he had felt trapped and powerless. But he also admitted that these were excuses. He had made choices, terrible choices, and he would regret them for whatever time he had left. Then it was Rosa's turn to address the court. She had written a victim impact statement, something she had worked on for weeks. As she stood at the podium, she held a photograph of Elena, the same one that used to sit on her parents' mantel. "My sister was 32 years old when she was taken from us," Rosa began, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had just gotten her big break, the role she had worked so hard for. She was talented, kind, and brave. She saw something wrong and she was going to do something about it. That's who Elena was. She stood up for what was right. Rosa talked about the years of not knowing, of wondering every day what had happened to her sister. She talked about her parents dying without answers. She talked about her daughter growing up without her aunt. She talked about all the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that had been stolen from their family. "For 22 years, my family lived in limbo," Rosa said. "We couldn't grieve properly because we didn't know. We couldn't have closure because there was no ending to the story. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, a part of me hoped it would be news about Elena. That hope became torture after a while." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, just listening. "But now we know the truth," Rosa continued. "Now we can finally say goodbye properly. Elena's story has an ending now, even though it's not the one we wanted. She didn't run away. She didn't abandon us. She was murdered by people who valued money more than human life. But her story also has meaning. She stood up against corruption. She tried to do the right thing. And even though it cost her everything, I'm proud of her for that courage." Rosa looked directly at Raymond. "You took my sister from us. You took my parents' daughter. You took my daughter's aunt. You took away years and years of love and memories. No sentence the judge gives you will ever be enough. But at least now everyone knows what really happened. At least Elena's name is cleared. At least the truth is finally out." When Rosa finished and returned to her seat, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the court officers were wiping away tears. The judge, a veteran of the bench named Howard Mitchell, took his time before speaking. He reviewed the evidence, the confession, the plea deal. He acknowledged that Raymond was an old man now, unlikely to pose any future threat to society. But he also emphasized the severity of the crime and the years of deception that followed. Raymond Walsh was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Given his age, it was likely a life sentence. He would probably die behind bars. As the bailiffs led him away, Raymond looked back at Rosa one more time. She didn't look away. She wanted him to see her face, to remember what his actions had cost. The case made national headlines for weeks. News programs did special segments on corruption in old Hollywood. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to Elena's story. Her case became part of a larger conversation about power, abuse, and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. But for Rosa, the media attention was secondary. What mattered was that she could finally lay her sister to rest properly. Elena's remains were released to the family, and they held a funeral service that should have happened 22 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended. Old friends from Elena's theater days, people who had worked with her on films, members of the missing persons advocacy groups Rosa had worked with over the years, and Detective Lisa Torres, who had brought Elena home. They buried Elena next to their parents in a cemetery in East Los Angeles. The headstone read, Elena Rodriguez, 1946 to 1978. Beloved daughter, sister, actress, and truth-teller, forever in our hearts. Detective Frank Chen, now 80 years old, and retired for 5 years, came to the funeral in a wheelchair. His health wasn't great, but he insisted on being there. After the service, he approached Rosa with tears streaming down his face. "I never gave up on her case," he said softly. "Not really. I just ran out of leads. I'm so sorry it took this long." Rosa hugged him. "You did everything you could. Elena knows that. Thank you for caring about her all these years." In the months that followed, several good things came from Elena's tragedy. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office created a new cold case unit with better resources and technology. Rosa worked with lawmakers to pass legislation protecting witnesses who report financial crimes. A film school in Los Angeles established the Elena Rodriguez Scholarship for aspiring actresses from immigrant families. Isabel, Rosa's daughter, graduated law school and became a prosecutor. Inspired by her aunt's courage and her mother's persistence, she dedicated her career to seeking justice for victims who couldn't speak for themselves. Rosa continued her advocacy work for families of missing persons, but now she could do it with the authority of someone who had finally found answers. She spoke at conferences, helped other families navigate investigations, and pushed for better resources for cold cases. Elena's story gave hope to others who were still waiting, still wondering, still searching. On the first anniversary of finding Elena, Rosa drove up to the Hollywood Hills. The construction site had long since been completed, those luxury homes now occupied by wealthy families who probably didn't know the history of the ground beneath them. But near the site, the city had placed a small memorial plaque. It read, "In memory of Elena Rodriguez and all those whose voices were silenced. May the truth always find its way to light." Rosa stood there for a long time, looking out over the city her sister had loved. Los Angeles sprawled below, glittering in the afternoon sun, still the city of dreams and broken hearts it had always been. Somewhere down there, young actresses were still arriving, still hoping to make it, still believing their talent and determination would be enough. Rosa hoped they would make it. She hoped they would be safe. She hoped they would never have to face the kind of evil that Elena had faced. "I miss you every day," Rosa whispered to the wind. "But at least now you can rest. At least now everyone knows you were a hero. You stood up for what was right, and that took real courage. I'm so proud to be your sister." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rosa placed flowers at the memorial. Then she drove home, to the life she had built, to the family she had raised, to the work she still had to do. The pain of losing Elena would never completely go away. That kind of loss leaves a permanent mark. But now, at least, there was peace. Now there was closure. Now there was truth. Elena Rodriguez's story ended tragically, but it also revealed something important about the human spirit. Truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under tons of earth. Justice may move slowly, but it can still arrive. And love, the kind of love Rosa had for her sister, never gives up. It endures through decades of uncertainty, through heartbreak and frustration, through the darkest nights of doubt. Sometimes the ground itself decides it's time to give up its secrets. Sometimes nature refuses to keep hiding what humans tried to conceal. And sometimes, after 22 long years, families finally get the answers they deserve. Elena's voice had been silenced, but her story was finally heard. And that, Rosa knew, was something worth fighting for.